Miracles Among the Rubble by Carol R. Gray. The Yellow Rose. Almost 6 years had passed since my visit to the hospital. They were 6 wonderful years of renewed strength and life. A new baby boy, Jamie, had arrived to fill our home with such joy and thankfulness. He was a miracle that was to be followed 3 years later by 2 more little boys, Thomas and Christopher. They were our delightful and adventurous twins. Could anyone's life be more complete, blessed, and busy than mine? I thought, as I looked at my family once they were all in bed for the night. Answering the phone one morning as I sought to referee breakfast time with 3 little boys under the age of 4, I was taken aback at the request of the well-spoken woman on the other end of the phone. Dodging the flying missiles of soggy cornflakes and stodgy Weetabix, I listened intently to all that she was saying. Would you be interested in being trained as a volunteer bereavement counsellor for St. Luke's Hospice? St. Luke's was a remarkable place. People with a terminal illness would be admitted there towards the final weeks of their illness, to be treated lovingly with dignity, compassion, and without pain. She knew of my past, and my doctor had put forward my name as a suitable person for such a responsibility. Needless to say, I accepted wholeheartedly. It would be an honour to give back a little to the community that had so lovingly taken care of me during my own illness with cancer. I spent several weeks in reading and being taught the basics of a listening ear and compassionate counselling skills. All too soon, it was time to begin the delicate process of visiting those families who were preparing to lose a loved one. My heart searched through my own memories as I sought to comfort and prepare them for the fear of letting go and the pain and sorrow of separation. One day, as I nervously knocked on the front door of a small, neat, and tidy bungalow for the first time, my heart beat rather quickly. It was always a nerve-wracking experience, meeting couples and families for the first time, especially under the circumstances as a bereavement counsellor. I was never quite sure how they would react to a total stranger visiting with them at such heartbreaking and emotive times. Usually they were quite wonderful and welcomed me in with open arms and a grateful air of reassurance that they would not be suffering alone. Slowly the white door of the bungalow opened to disclose a very elderly man. Small of stature, with lovely white hair and the bluest eyes I had ever seen. His welcoming hand and cheery smile made me feel immediately at ease. "Please come in," he said. "We've been waiting for you. We have been looking forward to you coming." I sat down on the old and comfy chair opposite where the elderly man had returned to sit next to his wife. Briefly, I observed the very frail but beautiful lady who reached for the comforting hand of her husband. A look of love passed between them, and a lump came to my throat. The hot tears of emotion burned my eyes as I fumbled through my briefcase, looking for an unnecessary pamphlet in the hopes of pulling myself together before they noticed my tears. Here was a room filled with love and companionship. The moment I entered the room, I could sense a light that was not dependent upon the sunshine outside. It resided within the home, created by 2 lovely persons whose love and respect for each other had not been diminished by the sands of time. Here were a couple whose love affair with each other had painted a living picture of togetherness that was as radiant as the sunshine itself. I had spent time with other families over the last 18 months. During the final weeks of their loved ones' illnesses and subsequent death, and such memories filled me with great sadness. Here was a couple whose parting from each other would cause my heart to tremble. Silently, I sought the Lord's inspiration that he might help me to do and say those things that would comfort and sustain them. The weeks went by, filled with daily visits to my lovely couple's home, and we became very close. When heart speaks to heart, a loving bond is formed. For hours I would sit and listen as they relived their happy past and a celebration of their life together. Certainly the disappointments and heartaches of life had accompanied them from time to time, but together they had turned them into stepping stones of resilience and love. Unable to have children of their own, they had turned their hearts to each other and lived as one in thought and deed. One afternoon I received the call I had been dreading. My dear Fred was about to lose his beloved Maggie. Calling from the hospital, his voice barely audible through the panic and gentle sobs, he beseeched me to be with them. Fortunately for me, I had a wonderful neighbour, Mrs. Washer, who without a second thought came to watch my children. Mrs. Washer was a neighbour in a million. Often when I was called out, such as today, she would look after the little ones. She seemed to enjoy the experience, though not half as much as my 3 little sons, who loved her so much. Phoning her, I explained about the call I had just received. She was around immediately, much to our children's delight, with her special homemade cakes and Washer treats. "Off you go. The children and I will be fine," she would always say in her soft Welsh accent. Climbing into my car and driving down the Outs Drive, I felt the distinct feeling that I needed to stop the car and cut a single rose and take it to the hospital. "She's not going to be interested in a single rose," I argued back to the prompting I had felt. Putting my foot down on the accelerator of the car, I drove further down the drive, but the feeling came again. Take a single rose to the hospital. Once more I questioned the prompting, and feeling rather irritated by my dithering and lack of urgency, I drove out of the drive and onto the busy road that led to the hospital. Within seconds of leaving the driveway of my home, an inner voice spoke to me, quietly and gently, and yet so forcefully that it seemed to penetrate and fill my whole being. Its message, just as before, was simple, but this time quite specific. "Carol, go back to your garden and cut a single yellow rose and take it to the hospital." Feeling quite chastened, I obediently turned the car around and drove into the in-drive of my home. Our rambling home was almost 150 years old and had a spectacular garden. The previous owners had filled the garden with every rose and flower you could imagine. I knew my garden well and had spent many hours each week lovingly tending it. It was full of long-stemmed roses of every colour and fragrance, except yellow. "But my neighbour has yellow roses," I thought to myself. I pulled up into the driveway and contemplated jumping over the wall into her garden and taking one. "I know she won't mind." Then there in front of me, straight and tall, was the most exquisite yellow rose I had ever seen. It was growing on one of my pink-stemmed varieties. Never before had that particular rosebush produced a yellow rose. The yellow petals were fringed all around the edge with a beautiful salmon pink. Staring at the rose in disbelief, I climbed out of my car and walked over to it in amazement. Such beauty was hard to explain, and as I felt its velvety petals, I recognized that this exquisite and miraculous flower bore the graceful and gentle touch of the Lord. Running into my kitchen for some scissors and returning with haste, I feared that the rose had disappeared, a figment of my imagination. But no, it was still there in all its glory. I quickly cut the rose and placed it amidst a flurry of gypsophilia that also grew in my garden. Then I wrapped them in clear cellophane and tied a bright yellow bow around the bouquet. It was perfect. Gathering my precious gift and placing it gently on the front seat, I drove to the hospital with a warm feeling of peace and the knowledge that I was not travelling alone. The rose on the seat next to me was evidence of a loving Heavenly Father, prepared through his foreknowledge to bless one who grieved. As I parked the car and gathered my precious gift into my arms, I took a deep breath and walked into the hospital, with an inner beseeching that I would be of use and not afraid. Today was the day I had dreaded, and I knew Fred needed me to be strong. Over the months as Maggie's health deteriorated, Fred's composure crumbled with it. As her frailty increased and her strength diminished, Fred's shining blue eyes grew dim, and the pain of watching his companions slip away from him. I felt inadequate to meet his need, and searching for a tiny glimmer of hope, I turned to the Lord and prayed for the strength to lift the spirits of those who weep. 1,000 thoughts came to comfort me, and delightful memories filled my heart as I walked the paths leading to the hospital ward where my friends would be. Quietly standing outside the drawn curtains that surrounded Maggie's bed, I sought to gather myself. Drawing the curtain gently aside, I saw her asleep on the bed, frail, tiny, and barely breathing. Her white hair fell gently in lovely curls that surrounded a still beautiful face. At her side, clutching her hand, was Fred. Weary and anxious, he had fallen asleep with his head resting upon the little hand he was holding. It was a tender scene I did not wish to intrude upon. Placing the yellow rose on the bed near to their hands, I tiptoed out of the room and made my way to the sister's office to tell them that I had arrived and would be in the waiting room. But before I reached her office, I heard the sound of shuffling feet and quiet sobs. I turned around to see my lovely Fred with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Carol, how did you know? How did you know that today was our 70th wedding anniversary, and always on our special day I have given Maggie a single yellow rose?" What could I say? I had not known it was their wedding anniversary, but a loving Heavenly Father knew. He knew the deepest desire of a loving and heartbroken man, who was about to release the love of his life into worlds unknown to him. I was filled with that joyous gratitude that slowly dawns within the soul. Had I witnessed a miracle? That newfound wonder that knocks on the door to our heart, and as we open it enters, bringing in its wake the confirmation that the Lord is alive and well, that he lives, loves us, and knows us all. Were this not so, there would have been no yellow rose with salmon pink tips. There would have been no constant prompting by that still small voice. There would have been no indescribable joy in the eyes of an old lady who opened her eyes for the last time to see her beloved Fred holding a single yellow rose.